over 500,000 Scottish servicemen who were in uniform during the Great War. At the time, Scotland's population was a little over 4 million, which meant that half the adult male population of Scotland was in uniform at the time. So it was quite a large military establishment north of the border, second only to our friends the Serbs, and how many men served from Scotland. But I'm going to focus a little bit on mostly the uniforms and stuff that the soldiers had. I do have some weaponry to show off. I'm going to talk about the uniforms during the war, how they changed, what they were made of, and why some of them were so different at first. But, set the scene, a little bit of context. At the start of the war, the British Army was very small. There was, including the territorial forces, there were around 200,000 men who could serve at the start of the war. Sounds like a lot compared to today's military, but it was the smallest army in Europe. That's because Britain, the United Kingdom, focused on the Navy instead. A massive Navy, the biggest Navy in the world by quite some margin. And they focused on sailors and marines and protecting the United Kingdom by sea. The army was completely professional in the regular ranks. Even the territorial soldiers, whilst it was only a part-time job for them that they did at weekends and for a couple of weeks during the year, they still got together and trained, and everybody was paid to be soldiers. We didn't have conscription, we didn't have national service at the time. So the men who were in the regular army were all seasoned professionals. We were supplemented by the very brave, very capable Indian Army, which was part of the British Commonwealth at the time. And then you had small professional corps of troops in various other dominions, such as Canada and Australia, backed up by lots of local militias, who were not quite as good as the territorial forces, but same idea, men who got together on weekends, who got to dress up fancy and play the guns. But the army that we put to the field at the start of the war, very, very small, but very professional, very capable, and although it was a tenth of the size of what the French and the Germans could put in the field, every single lad there was trained to a very high standard. Now, one thing you will very probably recognise from this period is the British khaki colour that we have. Okay, so this is a serge wool tunic in that famous British khaki colour. Okay, this was the uniform for the vast majority of British soldiers from the start of the war to the end of the war. Whether you were an Englishman from the counties, whether you were a Northern Irishman from Belfast, or if you were a Highlander from Inverness, you would have worn a tunic of a version like this. Canadians had a very similar version. The Australians wore basically this. Even the Indian soldiers, when they eventually get the right kit for Europe, would wear stuff like this. Pass that around to feel what it's made of. So it's just thick khaki wool, made in dozens of factories across the United Kingdom and even imported from America. It's warm in cold weather. It's actually lovely to wear in cold weather. You can get very hot in the good weather. It stays relatively waterproof to a point, and then when it gets soaked through, it then stays soaked through forever. Very hard to dry once it has got wet, but it has a limited amount of waterproofing to keep the water out unless you're in the wet all day. And all the khaki bits of the uniform basically were made from this same material. So obviously you're looking at the tunic there, pure white. The trousers were made of the same wool serge as well. And you'll notice this is a slightly different tone, and that's just because the sheer amount of uniforms that were getting made, the dye wasn't always the same from factory to factory. So actually, you would have seen all sorts of different tones of khaki being worn. Eventually it's all going to fade to the same kind of dull khaki brown, but they were all slightly different shades and patterns. One detail about this tunic is the bottom of it is flat. It's buttons up and it's a nice flat bottom. Here, which Charles is going to hold up for me and pass over to me. This is a Highland tunic, and it's slightly different. And at the bottom of the tunic has this nice little cutaway. And the whole reason for that is when you're wearing your kilt, you want to show off your sporran when you're in undress. So when you're in battle, you're not wearing a sporran, but when you're in undress, you're going out to town, Glasgow, and Inverness and Aberdeen, you need to be able to wear your sporran, and they had to have cutaway in the tunic so the sporran would sit properly. That's how much thought they put into the Highland uniforms. But it's the same standard rule, same sort of colour. It's got the epaulets, it's got the 4 pockets, and it's got the same number of buttons all up and down. It just has this nice little cutaway so that Highlanders can look fancy. It's all about fashion for the Highlanders. Even down to the hooks at the back and the way it sits on the arse. One slight difference though, because you've got this cutaway, I'll grab it off you 2 seconds back. You might have noticed when you were looking at this tunic, there's a little pouch on the bottom right hand side. That is where soldiers kept their first field dressing. And for those of you who have served, you know that this is the field dressing you use on yourself. You don't use this on any of your mates. This is when you get hurt, you pull this out and you use it on yourself, or your mate pulls it out and uses it if you can't. Highlanders, they would usually keep theirs in whatever pocket they could fit it in because they don't have this nice little pouch, because that bit of the tunic doesn't exist in their jackets. Drape that one over the seat again for me for 2 seconds. Now, there is one slightly different one, I think you might have noticed down here. This lovely dark navy blue one. So at the start of the war, as I said, Britain had a massive navy. That's where all their money went, that's where all their focus went. There were so many sailors and so many Royal Marines that they couldn't actually find ships for them all, especially at the start of the war. There were more personnel than there were boats to put them on. Don't let any women hear me call it a boat. Marines especially, because you had 2 different branches of the Royal Marines. You had the Royal Marine Artillery and the Royal Marine Light Infantry. Royal Marine Artillery were the ones who were on ship more often because they, as well as being Marines who could fight with rifles, could also help the sailors fire the guns. The Royal Marine Light Infantry, it was their job to do landings, to come off the ships, land, attack strong points on shore, take away gun batteries and the like. So there wasn't as much call for the light infantry aboard ship as there was for the artillery. So at the start of the war there was a division of men put together called the Royal Naval Division, made up mostly of Royal Marine Light Infantry, it's the Royal Marine symbols and stuff on the jacket, lovely red chevrons that the Marines wore, and then the rest of the division was filled up by sailors in their ships. And they actually went into battle in Antwerp in 1914 wearing blue. It's made of exactly the same material as the tunic you just saw, but it's this lovely distinct blue and red. Looks great in a battlefield from the 19th century, but as you can imagine, in a war that was going to be dominated by quick-fire artillery and machine guns, you get a little bit of a problem. It stands out. And the French would find out this problem in 1914, as they wore a very similar colour of blue, and they wore lovely red trousers. Exactly. The French focused on elan. For them, it was all about charging forward, bayonets flashing, and our national pride and patriotism will win the day. German machine guns said differently. The British, they wore khaki because they had learned the lessons of the Polar War. At the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, as some of you may know, we were fighting a war against the Boers in South Africa, and they were expert marksmen. They could pick off British officers, British NCOs from hundreds of yards away. And at this point, although the British had some really good weapons, they hadn't been taught how to do individual fire. So the British learned marksmanship and riflemanship from fighting the Boers, and they also learned that khaki was great in not just foreign hot service, but in basically anywhere where the enemy was going to shoot. So the British, we wore khaki because that would camouflage us against the ground that we were fighting. The Germans, they camouflaged in grey because they were camouflaging against the smoke of battle, and grey is actually a fantastic camouflage, especially when you've got smoke, dirt flying in the air. Grey actually blends in really well. The French, they then decided to go for a colour called horizon blue, which is it's kind of a blue-grey colour. It's almost a denim kind of colour. Yeah, and it proved quite effective at camouflaging against the horizon. So when you're up and moving, it's harder to distinguish you from the skyline. This uniform that the Royal Marines wore very quickly was discarded, and we're talking as soon as the fighting around Antwerp was done and they evacuated Antwerp, they started replacing that with this traditional standard British, or as we call it in Arabic, the English standard uniform. That would be khaki tunic, the trousers, and then the famous British peak cap. Okay? So British soldiers from Wales, from England, from Northern Ireland, from Canada, all the way to Australia, believe it or not, would all wear this hat. The famous Australian slouch hat, something we'll come in a little bit later. We're going to a little bit. You were equipped with these hats, and this is what you would fight in. You would actually go into combat, into contact with the enemy, wearing the peak cap. Head protection hadn't been invented yet. Depending on where you were, you would wear a different dress. Scotsmen would wear the Glengarry that went with their regiment. So this is a rifle green one, because it's for a light infantry regiment. The Highland Light Infantry, that's the local Glasgow boys. Hill's last issue, the Highland Keeleys, whatever you want to call them, these were, they thought themselves a little bit of an elite, because they were known as light infantry. By this stage, the British Army, all infantry regiments were basically the same. But they thought of themselves as a little bit of an elite. You had different colours of Glengarry. You had the sort of standard dark blue one that most Highland units would wear. You would have some with red and white dicing on them, just depending on what battalion you were in. But you would wear that in combat. The Royal Marines at Antwerp wore a brodick, which is basically a peak cap with no brim. It's a little bit of an odd hat, but it's what they wore. It's kind of similar to the Navy's pork pie hat. And again, looks great, doesn't give you much protection. Yet the lads that went out to fight in Gallipoli, if they were lucky, would go out with that. Some men actually went to Gallipoli wearing these. You're talking it can get up to 45 degrees Celsius in the peninsula. They'd be wearing these, or if you were lucky, you would have a cork pith helmet. These were actually fantastic for protecting you from the sun, would keep you nice and cool, but it's made of cork, so it's going to offer absolutely no protection from artillery, which is your main threat in the battlefield. No protection from ballistics at all. And the Australians, and latterly the British forces, would also wear slouch hats in warm conditions. So Australians and New Zealanders would wear versions of these to Gallipoli. Scottish soldiers would wear these in Salonika when they were fighting against the Bulgarians. And it was only when we got to 1916 that the British Army started evolving its headdress to the conditions they were in. And we started seeing the precursors of this, which is the Brodie helmet, the first tin helmet. Now, the first of these started off as what you would call trench stores. So a soldier wasn't issued a helmet. A soldier, as he's filing up to the front line trenches where he was going to be fighting, he would grab one of these out of a bucket and he would take it with him. And when he was leaving the trench, he would throw it into another bucket so somebody else could pick it up and use that. But by the start of 1916, they'd started to issue them to individuals. So that every man would get them, and you get that famous British silhouette of the slightly tipped Brodie helmet with a wide brim. Now, the reason for the shape of this helmet, so obviously, well, not quite your time period, as we say, we're going to be hearing about some Dark Age combat and stuff. Into the medieval ages, they developed a type of helmet called a kettle helmet to protect from arrows coming in from above. And this was designed for exactly the same purpose. They copied the kettle helmet, made it much more simply, made it out of one piece of steel, stamped out, and then with a second piece of steel on the rim. And it's literally to protect you from shrapnel from above. If you imagine looking down on somebody from the top down, this will protect their head from shrapnel balls, and this wide lip is so that when the shrapnel hits, it gets deflected off, and it will protect your head and shoulders. Okay? It's not going to stop a bullet from one of these rifles. A bullet from one of these rifles will go straight through the front, through whatever's inside, and very probably still go out the other side of that. One of these rifles will put a bullet through a modern combat helmet at the right range. It's not to protect you from bullets, but it will protect you from shrapnel, which was the biggest killer in the battlefield. Don't let anybody tell you it was machine guns. Machine guns were scary and they killed a lot of men, but artillery was the biggest killer. Because artillery was going 24/7 and it's arcing up and going down into trenches, it's attacking infantry formations. Artillery is your killer. Deaths to shrapnel went down by 80% with the introduction of these helmets. Okay? Now that doesn't mean men weren't getting wounded, but men who would be killed wearing something like this, and a shrapnel ball goes straight through, that's stopping them dying. You might get a concussion, you might still broken bones, various things, but you're not going to die, and that's the most important thing. And those men, after they'd spent time recuperating, could then get put back in the line, which was the most important thing, was getting those bodies in the line. And the last wee hat I'll show you is the trench cap. So this, as you can see, it shares sort of design with the peak cap, but it was made much more simply. To get a hat to be this firm and this sort of this lovely shape takes a lot of stitching, it's a lot of pieces, and it's a lot of work. Trench cap's made with far fewer pieces, gives the same basic outline. You're only going to be wearing this when you're off duty and you're at the rear, so it doesn't need to be anywhere near this tidy as the peak cap. But it's the same kind of that British shape on it. You also sometimes saw some of these with little ear flaps that you pull down in winter to keep you warm. And you had various forms of headgear worn off the line. In the line, steel helmets became the norm. And as you can see, it shares a kind of colour. You go with your greens and your browns, because the British Army went in for a lot of sort of the early versions of camouflage. Okay? The last we've got a uniform I'm going to show you before moving on to some of the other kits is our Highland buddies still wore kilt in the battle. Okay? So these kilts are a little different from your modern fashion kilts. These will go right up and sit above your kidneys. They are full 8 yards of wool, not your 5-yard fashion kilts. That's 8 yards, and it's full thick wool all the way around. So these were great in cold weather, especially around the kidneys and the abdomen. Not so great in a trench condition though. As you can imagine, with all these pleats, the soldier's friend in the trench was lice. And kilts were the worst garment of all the British Army and Commonwealth forces for lice, because the little buggers would get inside the pleats and sit inside and grow their eggs and stuff all the way in there. Even worse than it would be on the rest of the Roman kit. To the point where soldiers would actually sit and kill lice together, sit talking as they're killing lice. Lice were called chats in India, and as the British Army spent so much time in India, they picked up words from there. So you're sitting killing chats in your clothes, you're sitting chatting. So you're sitting having a chat with your pals, you're chatting with your friends. You would use hot bits of metal, candles, hot irons to just pop the lice eggs. You can actually hear them popping as you're killing them. Highland soldiers were very proud of wearing the kilt in battle, despite the fact that it was bloody useless. It would catch in barbed wire. You can imagine those pleats getting caught in barbed wire and it's going to get tangled fairly easily. In the hot weather, it was too warm. If you got wet mud on the back and it dried in heat, it would cut and phase the back of your legs because they were hanging off the pleats. If you got it wet and it froze in winter, it would do exactly the same thing. The kilt also didn't give you much gas protection, especially things like mustard gas that came later on in the war. You're getting it right up to where it hurts. The kilt was also covered over with one of these. So it's a khaki kilt apron, and it's there to camouflage the kilt. Some people will tell you it's to protect the kilt from getting dirty. I can guarantee you that has no effect on how much mud gets on your kilt, because I've been in an actual trench on more than one occasion in a kilt, and the mud will get you no matter where you go. But what it does is it camouflages your kilt to your uniform. Okay? As you've seen, you've got your nice khaki tunic, but the kilt itself is dark, it's got lots of different colours on it, and it stands out. It makes a really nice aiming point for the board. When we were fighting in South Africa, they could pick out Highland soldiers because they had a nice big white sporran on a dark kilt and a khaki jacket with a cracking aiming point. So, absolutely. So yeah, your khaki kilt cover goes around the kilt, camouflages it, stops you getting killed. It also had the added benefit of the Germans not knowing which regiments they were fighting, because different Highland regiments would have different coloured overstripes on the kilts. If you've got one of these over it, you can't wait to tell where you are. The British Army had a vast array of different bits of kit. They had slightly different material tunics for wearing in hot conditions. So you'd actually have tunics made of the same material as the kilt apron for when you're fighting in places like Gallipoli or Salonika in Palestine. However, as anybody who served in the British Army knows, they're not always great at getting you the kit you're meant to have when you have it. Which is why at the start of the Gallipoli campaign, we saw soldiers from Scotland go off in full woolen kit and kilts to fight in Gallipoli, and British Indian soldiers coming over in summer weather to fight in October in the Western Front. Yes, not necessarily always the best logistical sense, despite having some of the best kit the British Army's ever had. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is the best equipped British Army there's ever been. The webbing that they had is the pattern 08 canvas webbing that again I held earlier and felt really told. This webbing was revolutionary for its time. Up until this point, most armies would wear leather webbing. In fact, I think I have some with me. Yeah, there you go. They would wear simple leather pouches that would maybe go across your shoulders. The German webbing especially was worn across the waist, and put all the weight of that ammunition on your hips and your lower back, which as soldiers will know is terrible. You don't want all your weight to go into the small of your back. This webbing was designed to be multi-part, so you could take bits off as needed to get to casualties. It had cross belts that would go across your back, and it would be able to hold all the bits that you needed. This one. It straps across the front with a waist belt, and it gives a nice strong hold. The good thing about canvas webbing is in the heat, it's not going to dry out and crack and break like the leather can. In the wet, it's not going to rot as leather does. It gets a little bit heavier, but it gets wet, it dries, and it's still completely usable. You have your ammunition on the front, you have your small pack on your back, and that gives you 3 days of food to keep you going if you get into the enemy lines. You have your water bottle on your hip, that takes a pint of water, or cold tea, never alcohol. If you were caught with alcohol, you were on a serious charge for that, because every soldier was given his ration of alcohol, he didn't need to carry his own. So that was water or cold tea at best. And then on my left hip, I have the handle for my entrenching tool, and I've got my bayonet. Okay? So the soldier would carry everything he needed to for combat. And this webbing actually balances out really nicely. It distributes weight across your shoulders and your hips. And it's designed in such a way that it's not going to sort of put out your back.
you see that sworn in?